It was 6:42 a.m. when the piece cracked. Emily Rivera was still in her slippers, sipping half-cold coffee on the porch of her new home in Ridgewood Estates. Her son Miles was still asleep inside, and the breeze carried the faint smell of blooming roses, the ones she planted herself 2 months earlier. Everything felt still, safe, until she noticed it. A yellow slip peeking from the mailbox, folded once, stamped urgent, HOA notice. She opened it, and the moment she read the first line, her stomach dropped. Violation of Ridgewood Residential Code number 117A. Vegetation encroaching walkway perimeter. Her rosebush. She stared at it in disbelief. Beautiful red blooms, maybe brushing half an inch onto the sidewalk. She laughed, thinking it must be a mistake. But as she flipped the page over, she saw photos, time stamped. They'd been watching her yard. That laughter turned to confusion, then unease. The letter wasn't signed by a neighbor. It came directly from the HOA board, with a $50 fine and a warning that continued violations will escalate to enforcement review. That phrase, enforcement review, sounded like something out of a courtroom. And it wasn't just a one-time warning. Over the next week, Emily received 3 more letters, then 2 citations. Then, mysteriously, her garbage can was tipped over and her recycling was flagged as non-compliant. Something wasn't right. This wasn't about roses. Emily tried calling the HOA. The number rang endlessly. She emailed nothing. She tried showing up at the HOA office listed on the letter. It was closed, boarded up. It wasn't until she spoke to her neighbor, Mrs. Franklin, that the whispers began. "Mr. Thorne's looking to rezone this row," Mrs. Franklin said in a hushed voice. "He doesn't like families, especially ones who don't vote his way." Emily didn't know what that meant, yet. She just knew that every day she felt less welcome. Her son came home saying the neighbor kids weren't allowed to play with him anymore. One of them said, "Your mom's in trouble." What kind of trouble? Emily had no idea. She didn't host loud parties. She didn't break rules. She paid her dues. But every rose has thorns. And Mr. Thorne, the HOA president, was just getting started. The next envelope didn't come in the mail. It was hand-delivered by a man in a polo shirt with a clipboard. He didn't introduce himself. He just looked around her yard and mumbled, "Violation confirmed." Emily asked him what this was really about. "Ask the board," he said. She would. But they wouldn't answer. In fact, they never spoke to her directly again. Everything came through typed letters, photos, threats. That night, she sat in her kitchen searching Ridgewood HOA lawsuits, and the results chilled her. 6 homeowners had left the neighborhood in the last 3 years, all citing constant harassment. And at the center of it all was Thorne. Emily hadn't chosen a home. She'd walked into a power game, and the players weren't playing fair. What she didn't know was that she was about to meet the one person who could shift everything. But not before things got worse, much worse. Before justice came fear. Before truth came silence. And before safety came war. Yes, Officer James Carter wasn't supposed to be at her door that morning. Emily wasn't the kind of person who attracted police visits. She paid her bills. She taught her son respect. She kept to herself. But Ridgewood wasn't the kind of neighborhood where the rules were meant to protect you. Here, rules were tools, and the people holding them knew how to cut. When Emily opened the door, she saw the badge and panicked. "Emily Rivera?" the officer asked. She nodded. "Mind if I speak with you a minute?" His tone wasn't hostile. In fact, it was almost apologetic. James Carter was new to the Ridgewood beat. He'd transferred from a larger district after a case involving a whistleblower officer had left him burned. He thought this quiet suburb would be simple, predictable. But nothing about Emily's file made sense. He'd been dispatched because of a formal HOA complaint citing aggressive behavior toward an HOA official. "Do you recall an incident with Mr. Caldwell?" he asked. Emily blinked. You mean the guy with the clipboard who didn't say a word and walked around my house like I wasn't standing there? James smirked. It was his first clue. He asked to see the letters. She handed him a stack. His brows furrowed deeper with every line. The citations were flimsy, the language aggressive. This looks more like intimidation than code enforcement, he said. Emily nodded. Finally, someone who saw it. He stayed longer than expected, asked questions, took notes, promised to file a report. But Emily didn't expect to see him again. Until 2 days later he returned, off duty, jeans and a button-down shirt. Just checking in, he said, holding a coffee. Emily was hesitant, but the wall was cracking. They sat on her porch, talked about the roses, her job, her son. She asked why a cop would care about an HOA dispute. Because I've seen how these things grow, he said, and who they bury. Emily didn't know then, but James had watched his own father lose a home to HOA corruption. He'd joined the force to stop bullies. Ridgewood just gave him a new battlefield. As the sun set, a car slowed in front of her house. Deborah Hale sat behind the wheel, watching. James noticed. Friendly neighborhood eyes? He asked. Emily sighed. She's not watching for safety. James took one last look at the roses before standing. Keep those trimmed, but don't stop growing them. Emily watched him go. Something had shifted. She felt it. For the first time since this started, she wasn't alone, but being seen was dangerous. And in Ridgewood, the HOA didn't like loose ends. Deborah Hale didn't miss much in Ridgewood. She called herself retired, but she worked harder than most, as Ridgewood's unofficial surveillance camera. Her blinds were barely ever shut. Her phone had a speed dial list longer than the HOA's directory. Some called her the watchwoman. Others, though not to her face, called her the warden. She saw everything. And what she saw this time unsettled her. Officer James Carter, off duty, sitting casually on Emily Rivera's porch. Laughing, listening, smiling. That wasn't normal, not here. And Deborah didn't like things that weren't normal. She watched with a pair of binoculars, listened when she could. Then she did what she always did. She picked up the phone. First, she called Mr. Thorne. "They're getting close," she whispered. "He's not just patrolling, he's involved." Then she called 2 other board members, and by the next morning, whispers had already turned into meetings. A narrative was forming. Emily wasn't a single mom anymore. She was manipulative. She was using her feminine influence on law enforcement. And James? He wasn't doing his job. He was compromising the neighborhood's standards. The HOA board members began crafting memos, not official notices, but internal gossip newsletters. Deborah handed out copies in mailboxes labeled, "For your safety." Emily became the story. At the supermarket, people stared. Miles came home saying another kid said, "Your mom's dating a cop." But Emily wasn't dating anyone. She was defending herself. Alone. And yet, she smiled when she saw James's car pull up. He hadn't stopped checking on her. "They're watching us," she said one day. "Then let them watch," James replied. But he knew what it meant. His own supervisor had asked him quietly, "Is there a personal relationship we should know about?" It was Ridgewood's version of a warning shot. The board didn't need facts. They only needed a story, one they could weaponize. Deborah kept the pressure on. She filed her own formal complaint. Undue favoritism toward a resident under multiple active citations. Emily found a copy of it taped to her garage door. It was getting personal now. And the truth is, Deborah didn't even hate Emily. She hated what Emily represented: change, resistance, independence. Deborah believed in rules, in control. And people like Emily, with their rose bushes and their soft eyes and their refusal to just conform, they didn't belong, at least not in her Ridgewood. But what Deborah didn't realize is that every eye turned outward eventually sees itself. And while she was watching Emily, Someone else had started watching her. James had a camera, and he had begun documenting. Because sometimes the best way to fight shadows is to bring in the light. Rage. Every war has a moment when the whispers turn to shouts, when the pressure breaks and the real fight begins. For Emily, that moment came on a Tuesday, 8:07 a.m. Two men in black arrived at her door. They weren't police. They weren't code officers. They were private security, hired directly by the Ridgewood HOA board. Their uniforms had no badge, no name, just a logo, Community Compliance Division. One of them, the taller one, knocked without looking at her door. The other paced near the side gate. Emily opened it slowly, phone already recording. "We're here for an unscheduled property inspection," the tall one said. "Rear perimeter vegetation, possible illegal fencing." Emily's breath froze. "That's my backyard," she replied. "You're not stepping foot past that gate." The man held up a paper. Per HOA Regulation 4.3, entry is permitted for grounds violations with photographic proof. She looked at the paper. It wasn't signed, not notarized, just printed, and it wasn't legal. "You're trespassing," she said. The second man chuckled. "That depends who owns the land. HOA regulations supersede easement rights within boundary zones." It was pure jargon, designed to confuse. But Emily wasn't confused anymore. She was angry. She raised her phone and said clearly, "You're not getting in my yard. I've called the police." As if on cue, a siren sounded in the distance. And within 90 seconds, a familiar car rolled up. James. This time, he didn't walk slowly. He stepped between her and the two men. "You're done here," he said calmly. The taller man held his ground. "We have the right to—" "You have nothing. This is private property. You've issued no notice, no signed documents, and you're not law enforcement. Leave, now." The men hesitated, then turned, left without a word. Emily nearly collapsed. James stayed. And what he told her next made her knees go weak. "They've filed an escalation complaint. They're trying to foreclose on you." The letters, the fines, the harassment. It was all building to this. $980 in unpaid HOA fees. Most of them stacked fines over petty violations. Ridgewood's bylaws allowed foreclosure proceedings if a resident owed more than $700 for 90 consecutive days. Emily had 18 days before they could legally take her home. She wasn't just fighting citations anymore. She was fighting for survival. James stayed longer that night. He asked about her mortgage, her documents, her records. He told her something she would remember for the rest of her life. "This is bigger than you. This is how they've been getting away with it for years." That night, James filed his own report, not as an officer, but as a whistleblower. The Ridgewood HOA was about to meet resistance, and Emily was done playing nice. No more quiet walks. The night after the confrontation with the private enforcers, Emily Rivera didn't sleep. She didn't cry, she didn't panic. She printed, she wrote, she documented. For hours, her dining table transformed into a war room. Letters, receipts, photographs, timestamps. Her inbox became an archive of HOA intimidation. And sitting across from her was Officer James Carter, off-duty, jacket off, sleeves rolled up. What began as neighborly concern had turned into a mission. James had seen corruption before, but this was surgical, precise, legal, and dressed in paperwork. Ridgewood's HOA had weaponized the rule book. James pulled out a manila folder labeled Retaliation Files. Inside were 5 other cases, homeowners in different towns who had gone up against their HOAs and lost. Some lost their homes. One lost custody of their child. It was a pattern. Emily scanned each one. Different names, same tactics. Excessive fines for minor violations. Faked complaints from anonymous neighbors. Forced board votes with no public input. Surprise inspections without warrants. But Ridgewood's board was worse. Thorne didn't just want control. He wanted obedience. Emily whispered, "Why me?" James paused. "Because you didn't fold." She had become a symbol, and symbols must be broken or made stronger. The next step wasn't defense, it was offense. James suggested filing an official complaint with the county commissioner. "Document everything," he said. "Print what they don't want seen. If they bury you in paper, bury them back." Emily began drafting a counter-petition to expose the Ridgewood HOA board for overreach, misconduct, and harassment. Within 3 days, she had 14 signatures. Quiet support began to surface. A retired veteran down the street brought her photos of board members on her property at night. A teenage girl slipped her a USB drive with footage her security cam caught. HOA agents tampering with Emily's garbage cans. People had been watching, but now they were speaking. Mr. Thorne noticed, and that's when the files started disappearing. Her HOA app login was locked. Her community forum posts deleted. Then a fake notice showed up at her door claiming she owed over $2,000. James traced it to a printer not even registered to Ridgewood. The board was now creating fake fines. Emily realized this wasn't just HOA harassment. It was targeted retaliation. And retaliation meant one thing. They were afraid. Not of her roses, not of her porch, not of her words. They were afraid she might win. That night, she filed her own formal legal complaint with the county and hired a small civil rights attorney named Amanda Lewis. It was no longer Emily against the HOA. It was Emily versus the machine. And with a whistleblower by her side and proof stacking up, the machine was cracking. Ridgewood's day. In every battle, there's a moment the enemy stops hiding. For Emily Rivera, that moment arrived one night in the sound of gravel under tires. She peeked out her window and saw a black SUV inching down the street. Headlights low, no plates. It paused at her driveway and kept going, just enough to be noticed, just enough to send a message. That same night, a wooden stake appeared in her front yard. Nailed to it was a sign, "Non-compliant property, under review." No HOA stamp, no official paper, just bold red letters. The next morning, her trash bins were overturned. Her car's back tire slashed. Her son's bike gone. Emily reported it all. But the officer on duty that day wasn't James, and the report never made it to the database. When James found out, he confronted the department supervisor. What he heard chilled him. "You're too close to this case. You need to step back." James refused. That night, his patrol schedule was changed. He was reassigned. 2 days later, his own mailbox was smashed in. Emily tried to reassure him, but she couldn't hide the fear in her own chest. Amanda Lewis, her attorney, advised her to install full security. "You're being intimidated," she said. "They're trying to trigger fear and force compliance." Emily set up 3 security cameras, motion lights. She began live streaming her front yard at night. The video feed caught strange figures, hooded, walking the perimeter at 3:13 a.m. Amanda submitted the footage to the county as evidence of coordinated psychological harassment. Meanwhile, the HOA board filed another escalation. This one, unsafe property, creating anxiety among residents. They were flipping the narrative. Emily wasn't the victim, she was the threat. A special board meeting was announced. But Emily wasn't invited. The agenda? Authorization of emergency bylaw enforcement. A loophole clause that, if passed, would allow the board to remove disruptive homeowners via outside legal means. Amanda fought to attend and was denied. But she leaked the agenda. And suddenly, the community began to stir. A petition against the emergency clause gained 200 signatures in 36 hours. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years began speaking up. "They fined me $300 for a missing fence picket. I was told to repaint my door 3 times in 1 month. My dog was nearly taken by animal control, called in by the HOA." What Emily had exposed was now everyone's problem. The HOA struck back, but they had drawn too much attention. News trucks rolled into Ridgewood. Whistleblower claims HOA harassment, the headlines read. Emily stood on her porch, camera in her face, eyes tired, but clear. "I'm not backing down," she said. "This is my home, and I will defend it." And for the first time, she did. They never expected her to show up. But she didn't just show up. She walked into that hearing like it was a battlefield. The Ridgewood Community Hall hadn't seen this much traffic in years. Over 120 residents packed inside, some angry, some confused, most just curious. On one side sat the Ridgewood HOA board, Edward Thorne, the president, Deborah Hale, the watchwoman, two others who rarely spoke. On the other side, Emily Rivera, holding a folder thick with evidence. Beside her, Amanda Lewis, her attorney. And just behind them, James Carter, in full uniform, off-duty, but fully present. The meeting opened like all HOA hearings. "Thank you for attending. Tonight's agenda will address claims made against the board by resident Emily Rivera." Polite, cold, scripted. But Emily didn't read from a script. She stepped up to the podium and opened with a line no one forgot. "If silence is compliance, then I've been compliant long enough." Gasps. She spoke for 17 minutes, calm, clear, strong. She listed 23 letters of violation, 9 unauthorized inspections, 4 forged documents, 2 attempted entries. She played video footage of men lurking at her property, displayed photos of the fake fines, read witness statements from neighbors, and then she dropped the final card, a printed report signed by Officer James Carter. "Evidence suggests coordinated harassment targeting resident Rivera through abuse of HOA authority, recommending civil investigation." The room fell silent. Thorne spoke next. His voice was calm, but his hands trembled. "Ms. Rivera has clearly made an emotional case, but this board operates within the law. All actions were taken in accordance with bylaws." Amanda stood. "Then let's read the bylaws." She highlighted loopholes Thorne had exploited. She quoted an amendment from 2017 that gave emergency power, signed during a hurricane evacuation. "You've used natural disaster clauses to punish families," she said. Then the questions began. Residents raised hands. "Why was I fined for planting tomatoes? Why was my security camera removed by HOA order? Why was Mr. Nguyen told to repaint his house 3 times in 6 months?" One by one, voices rose, and Thorne's control unraveled. Emily watched as the machine cracked in real time. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The truth had taken on a voice of its own. In the final moments, a vote was called. Should a third-party legal review of the HOA board be initiated? 87 hands rose. Only 4 opposed. It passed. As Emily walked out of that room, someone handed her a folded note. Inside, "You started something. Don't stop now." Outside, reporters waited. Flashbulbs, microphones. "Ms. Rivera, any comment?" She smiled. "Roses grow back. So do we." Within 48 hours of the community vote, the walls began to shake. The Ridgewood HOA office, once the quiet nerve center of control, now buzzed with uncertainty. County auditors arrived unannounced. They asked for books, emails, budgets, and the board panicked. Edward Thorne was the first to disappear. His office, once neatly arranged, now abandoned, with his desktop wiped and his mailbox locked. But digital footprints are hard to erase. Amanda Lewis had anticipated this. A subpoena forced the release of Ridgewood's financials going back 5 years. What it revealed was staggering. Over $67,000 in consulting fees to companies owned by Thorne's cousin. HOA fines rerouted to private bank accounts. A falsified landscaping contract charging for work never completed. The fines against Emily weren't the worst abuse, just the most visible. Amanda filed an emergency injunction. The HOA board's powers were frozen. A temporary oversight committee was put in place by the county, and the Ridgewood HOA's reputation shattered. News coverage exploded. Emily appeared on local TV, This isn't just about rules. It's about power and what happens when no one watches the watchers. But the watchers weren't done watching. Deborah Hale, the watchwoman, refused to step down. She appeared on a podcast defending the board. This was about neighborhood pride. People like her don't understand what community means. But public sympathy was no longer on her side. Anonymous tips flooded in. Residents brought forward emails, recordings, meeting notes. One neighbor handed Amanda a thumb drive. It had video of a secret meeting at Deborah's house. HOA members discussing how to put pressure on Emily. Emily watched the clip silently, then said, "They knew. They planned this." Meanwhile, James Carter testified under oath at the county hearing. His words were clear. "I believe the Ridgewood HOA engaged in coordinated psychological harassment, abuse of authority, and attempted property theft through fraudulent penalties." Emily sat in the front row. The same woman who once trembled reading letters alone now faced down the very people who tried to bury her. And for the first time, they blinked. Deborah was formally removed. 3 board members resigned. But the battle wasn't over. Amanda filed a civil suit on behalf of Emily and 5 other residents. The charge, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages sought, $2.1 million. And the impact? Nationwide. Other communities began inspecting their HOAs. Emily had lit a fire, and it wasn't burning her down. It was clearing the way. Ridgewood had changed, but the war for fairness in neighborhoods had just begun. And Emily? She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who'd ever been silenced behind picket fences. That's the right form. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or banners. It arrives in the sound of birds returning to your window. In the first night of silence after months of threats. In the way your chest feels when you realize you're not afraid anymore. That's how restoration began for Emily Rivera. Not with court victories, not with headlines, but with peace. A kind of peace she hadn't known in over a year. It started small. She woke up one morning and didn't check her mailbox first. She drank her coffee while it was still hot, not while typing up legal documents. Her front yard, once a battleground, began to grow again. The rose bushes she fought so hard to protect bloomed. And this time, she didn't just water them. She stood among them, breathed them in, let them remind her of everything she'd survived. The neighbors began to change too. At first, it was small gestures, a wave from across the street, a nod from a man who once avoided her eye. Then came something new, conversations. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," one neighbor said. "You gave us all a voice," another whispered at the community board. The same HOA board that once issued threats had been replaced with a volunteer committee. Their first act? Removing over 300 violation notices that had been filed under suspicious circumstances. Their second? Voting unanimously to install a public suggestion board at the entrance of Ridgewood. At the top of that board, Neighborhood Voices Matter, a community that listens, thrives. Emily walked past it every morning. She smiled when she saw messages, "Lost puppy near Oak Street." "Yard sale this Saturday, bring cash." "Thank you, Emily, we see you." James Carter still came by. Not as a cop, not as a savior, just a friend. They talked about simple things now, what books they were reading, what kind of mulch was best for rose gardens. The lawsuit still moved forward, slowly, methodically. But Emily no longer centered her life around it. Amanda Lewis handled the paperwork. Emily handled living. She started journaling again. Her first entry read, "I remember when all I wanted was to be left alone. Now, I want to be heard, and I want others to be heard too." Emily Lewis hadn't still wanted people to walk to this tests, and even plans after the environment of her garden's traits. Her out-how friend wanted finally based of in its few church. That idea turned into something more. She began writing about HOA abuse, quiet control, neighborhood intimidation. She published her first blog post, "What it feels like to be watched in your own home." It was read by 10,000 people in a week. Comments poured in. "This is my story too. You put into words what I've felt for years. I showed this to my HOA. They backed off. Emily realized something. This wasn't just her fight anymore. Her healing wasn't just for her. It was for others who hadn't yet found their strength. And so she gave them hers. In words, in messages, in guidance. Her blog became Neighborhood Justice, then a podcast, all from the dining room table where she once cried over threat letters. Ridgewood changed, but so did Emily. One spring afternoon, she visited the community garden. She walked through rows of flowers planted by hands once too afraid to dig. A child came running toward her, barefoot and smiling. "You're the lady with the roses," he said. Emily knelt. "I guess I am," she smiled. Behind her, on the garden wall, a mural had been painted. A woman standing tall, holding a rose. Beneath it, in cursive letters, "The one who bloomed in battle." She touched it gently. The paint was still fresh. So was the memory. So was the fire. But now, it warmed her instead of burning. Restoration isn't a final step. It's a cycle, a rhythm. Some days, she still felt the tension, in meetings, in subtle glances. But now, she didn't flinch. She faced forward. Because once you've stood in the fire and come out stronger, you no longer fear the smoke. Emily had found her garden again, and this time she planted without fear. Not just roses, but hope. Quiet. And peace that could not be fined away. Legacies aren't born in courtrooms. They're not forged in victory speeches or paraded down red carpets. No. Real legacies are planted, deep in the hearts of the people who refuse to be forgotten. Emily Rivera never set out to become a legacy. In the beginning, she just wanted to protect her son, her garden, her peace. But the more they pushed her, the more they underestimated her, the more they forced her to become something greater. A voice, a mirror, a ripple in still water. Now, months later, Ridgewood was no longer the same. The HOA that once operated with unchecked authority had been dismantled, rebuilt from scratch. Elections were public now, finances audited. Every fine required evidence, every rule subject to resident vote. And behind every new reform, there was her shadow, not because she demanded it, but because the community had remembered what happened when one person stood up and refused to be crushed. Emily sat in her home office now, a converted guest room filled with files, letters, and small mementos of the storm she'd weathered. On the windowsill, a rose in a clay pot. On the wall, a framed letter from a woman in Texas. "Because of you, I filed my first formal complaint. I was scared, but you showed me I wasn't alone." On her desk, a stack of handwritten letters. From seniors, single moms, veterans, people who thought they were powerless until they heard her voice. She'd begun writing a book, not about laws, about truth, about how control begins in silence and how power feeds off isolation, about how fear can live in beautiful neighborhoods and how sometimes you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to refuse to sit down. She titled the first chapter, "The Price of Quiet." Her son, Miles, was older now. He remembered the fights, the warnings, the late-night whispers and mom crying behind a closed door. But now, he saw something else. A mother transformed, strong, respected, whole. He once told a classmate, "My mom made our neighborhood better. She didn't let them scare her." Emily smiled when she heard that, not because she wanted the credit, but because she knew her son had learned the most important lesson of all: never let someone take your voice. The podcast she launched, Neighborhood Justice, began receiving nationwide attention. Local TV interviews, a feature in a small documentary, invites to speak at town halls, HOA reform panels, even law schools. Not once did she call herself a hero. She said only this: "I was a woman with a garden. They came for it, and I decided to bloom anyway. One fall afternoon, she returned to the community garden where a mural had been painted of her holding a rose. She brought Miles with her. He stared at the wall and asked. Then she looked at the community around her, talking, planting, laughing freely. "No," she said, "not for a second." Behind her, someone placed a fresh bouquet of roses at the base of the mural. A handwritten card read, "For the one who taught us to speak." Emily closed her eyes, breathed it in, and smiled. Because her legacy wasn't painted on a wall. It lived in the lives she helped free. It lived in every neighbor who now questioned the rules, in every resident who stood up, in every voice that once trembled, now steady. The Ridgewood story became a national one. Policy proposals were named after her case. But for Emily, none of that mattered more than one simple truth. They wanted me silent, but I kept speaking. And now, the silence is mine. And it is beautiful. She said to show her setting our desks, typing at silence a cup of tea beside her, Miles in the other room humming, sunlight filling the space. On her screen, Chapter 12, How We Take Our Neighborhoods Back. And just below that, subscribe for more stories like this.